In the mid 1990s, the video game industry was standing in two worlds at once. On one side, developers had finally mastered 16-bit hardware. Years of iteration had turned limitation into confidence. Games were bigger, more expressive, and more cinematic than anyone ever thought possible on cartridges. On the other side, though, the future was already breaking through. CD-ROMs, 3D graphics, polygons replacing sprites, consoles preparing to abandon everything that they had just learned. Most studios responded by rushing forward. Square didn't. Instead, in some narrow space between mastery and uncertainty, Square made something strange. Not a sequel, not a flagship, not a technological leap. It was a game about dragons that you couldn't fully control, a strategy role-playing game that didn't behave like one, a project led by developers who were just getting started, built on hardware the studio already understood inside and out. It was called Bahamut Lagoon, and for nearly everyone outside Japan, it might as well have never existed. Today, we're venturing back into that narrow moment, when the old rules still worked, the new ones hadn't settled, and Square quietly handed the reins to a younger team with something to prove. So ready your dragons, study the battlefield, and join us as we uncover the story of a forgotten experiment from one of gaming's most influential studios on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 285th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. This week, we are talking about Bahamut Lagoon, a game created during one of the most fascinating transition points in Square's history. Released in February of 1996 for the Super Famicom, Bahamut Lagoon arrived at the tail end of the 16-bit era, just as Square was turning its attention toward the PlayStation and the unknown future of 3D role-playing games. It's a game that never left Japan, built by a team that was still finding its footing on hardware the studio had already mastered completely. And yet, it pushed presentation, structure, and systems in ways that didn't look backward or forwards, but sideways. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who would absolutely lose his mind the first time his dragon ignored his orders and did whatever it wanted. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, how long do you think you'd last before trying to micromanage a dragon that refuses to listen?
Well, Dave,
That's how you.
I'm already over it. I'm ready.
It sounds like a good one. Well played.
Thank
I
you.
took a drink too. Well, I'd ask you if you were familiar with Bahamut Lagoon, but since it was a Japanese only game, I know the answer to that. Although there was a fan translation, we'll cover that today. And I think there's going to be a few other little really good tidbits of information, one of which I think will literally smack you upside the head, that everyone's going to enjoy, I guess is the point. So I got a story to tell. And before I get to said story, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during this current week in gaming history?
Sure thing, Dave. Kicking it off on February 14th, 1991, Lemmings made its debut, introducing a puzzle concept unlike anything players had seen before. Developed by DMA Design, later known as Rockstar North, and published by Psygnosis, The game challenged players to guide waves of mindless lemmings through deadly environments using a limited set of abilities like digging, building, blocking, and climbing. Success depended on planning, timing, and occasionally sacrificing a few lemmings to save the rest. Its simple presentation masked increasingly complex puzzle design, making it accessible to newcomers while remaining deeply challenging. A massive commercial and cultural success, Lemmings spawned numerous sequels and ports and became one of the defining puzzle games of the early 1990s. We covered its creation and legacy along with DMA Design's early history back in episode 129. So to learn more, go there.
First of all, Lemmings is a fantastic game. I revisited it again recently. Again, we're doing daily history gaming videos on just about every social media platform, and I have that queued up for the 14th. So I got to, put the video together. A lot of fun, and I remembered how much I love the Lemmings. I will always remember it because it's a Valentine's Day game. So that's my happy Valentine's Day game.
Very nice, Dave.
Yep. It's a good game. It's fascinating. And why it's significant to gaming history is fascinating too. So check out those social medias on Valentine's Day.
Or episode 129.
Both.
There you go. And with that, our next game was released on February 9th, 1999, when Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri was released, taking the foundations of civilization into a bold science fiction future. Developed by Firaxis Games and published by Electronic Arts, the game imagined humanity's first attempt to colonize an alien planet after leaving a fractured Earth behind. Rather than simply reskinning its predecessor, Alpha Centauri leaned heavily into narrative and ideology, framing its gameplay around 7 rival factions, each driven by competing philosophies about science, ecology, freedom, and control. Its deep research system, unit customization, and diplomacy mechanics allowed players to shape not just an empire, but a vision of humanity's future. Praised for its writing, atmosphere, and mechanical depth, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri became one of the most respected and influential entries in the 4X strategy genre.
Did you ever play Alpha Centauri?
I did not. I only ever played the mainline Civ games.
I never played it either. I think that's one we should try since, well, at least I'm a fan of science fiction.
Okay, Dave, whatever. Sure, I'm not either. Next up, on February 10, 2000, Vagrant Story was released for the PlayStation in Japan, standing out as one of Square's most ambitious RPGs of the era. Directed by Yasumi Matsuno, the game unfolded in the dark, decaying city of Lea Monde, following risk-breaker Ashley Riot as he navigated political intrigue and supernatural threats. Rather than traditional party-based systems, Vagrant Story emphasized solo exploration, weapon crafting, and a complex combat system built around grid-based targeting and enemy anatomy. Its cinematic presentation, mature themes, and demanding mechanics rewarded careful planning and attention to detail. Praised for its storytelling, atmosphere, and visual design, Vagrant Story has earned a lasting reputation as one of the most distinctive and acclaimed titles of the PlayStation era. And we explored its story and legacy in episode 180 of the podcast. So unless Dave's also posting a story about that, there's only one place to go check it out. Episode 180, go do it.
You obviously don't check out our social medias because today's the 10th. And guess what today's is?
Well, I hadn't looked today, Dave. So there you go. By the time this podcast is released, it'll already be out. So you can either check out episode 180 or the 10th edition of our gaming posts by Dave.
Look, we recently both just got home from our normal 9 to 5. So I don't know about you. I did not have any time to be on social media today. So go check it out. It's a good story.
Yeah, Dave. My time was spent on RuneScape. Come on.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Wait, you're still on RuneScape, right? Just to be clear.
Like right this second?
Yeah, like right this second.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I figured. Okay, move on.
Next up, on February 13th, 2003, Resident Evil Dead Aim was released, offering an experimental spin on Capcom's long-running horror franchise. Developed by Cavia and published by Capcom, the game blended traditional third person exploration with first person shooting segments, creating a hybrid style unique within the series. Set aboard a zombie infested cruise ship, the story followed Bruce McGivern and Fong Ling as they attempted to stop an Umbrella Corporation plot gone awry. While its mechanical departures divided fans, Dead Aim was noted for its atmospheric setting and willingness to experiment with the series' formula. Today, it stands as a distinctive side entry that reflected Capcom's broader willingness in the early 2000s to test new ideas within the Resident Evil universe. Awry.
Awry. It's a good word.
I'm just verifying, man. That's like I said,
Okay.
I've heard the word, but I've never used
That's
it. I've never
okay.
seen it in a sentence. That's weird.
Well, now I can't
I'm
say
still gonna
that
say it
anymore.
wrong.
Can't say that anymore. Resident Evil Dead Aim is unique.
I don't know anything
There,
about it.
it's a yeah. It's got some first person shooting in it. There aren't many Resident Evil games that have first person shooter, especially at that period in time. So it's a unique entry in the universe. Also, random people too. Bruce McGivern and Fong Ling.
I mean, how can you forget Fong Ling, Dave?
You're
Very
right.
important in Resident Evil.
I don't know how I could have ever forgotten Fong Ling.
Now, Bruce McGivern, I get it. I get it. You might have thought it was MacGyver, but no, sorry to break it to you.
Oh, good one.
But you know.
Yeah, I know.
And last up for this week in gaming history, on February 9th, 2010, Bioshock 2 was released, returning players to the decaying underwater city of Rapture from a new perspective. Developed by 2K Marin and published by 2K Games, the sequel placed players in the role of Subject Delta, one of the original Big Daddies, as he searched for his bonded little sister. Building on the foundation of the first game, Bioshock 2 refined combat with the ability to dual wield weapons and plasmids, introducing the Little Sister adoption system, and expanded Rapture's history through environmental storytelling. The game also included a multiplayer mode that explored the city's collapse before the events of the original. While often compared to its predecessor, Bioshock 2 was praised for its improved mechanics and emotional focus, solidifying its place as a meaningful expansion of the Bioshock universe.
Did we like Bioshock 2? I forget.
You know, Dave, I was literally just thinking to myself that I never got to play 2, and
Really?
I no, I never got to play 2 or Rapture or the third one, Infinite.
Infinite.
And I was just thinking how cool it would be to be a Big Daddy. Like, I really want to play it now, which means I got to play through the first one again because of my OCD. And yeah, so Bioshock in the near future, I hope.
No complaints. I have played all of them, and I thought Bioshock 2 was a great entry in the series. So
Well, I'll take your word for it, Dave, but I'm also going to try it for myself. But, I think that we have a different topic to talk about today. So, for all of our fans, let's talk about
yeah,
it. Would you
we have
kindly?
fans. Oh, good one. Good one. We have fans.
We have fan.
I concur. Thanks, Mom. I think I think it's hard, Rob, for many people today to fully wrap their heads around just how exciting the video game industry was as it moved through the mid 1990s. In 1993, home consoles, for instance, were dominated by fighting games. The best selling titles that year were Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, but just behind them were games like Super Mario All Stars, where we had all the old Marios, Super Mario Kart, which, we played a ton in our house, and Star Fox, which was revolutionary in its own right for its, 3D graphics.
Let's make one thing clear. Mario Kart may have been played a ton by you, but Star Fox was my game.
True statement. Very true. Well, I played Mario Kart with our sister a lot, and then
Yeah, y'all moved
I'll
out
admit,
by the point I could play.
yeah. Tucked into that top tier of games in '93 were two games from the studio we're looking at today, which is Square. One was Secret of Mana, which we covered back in episode 258, and the other was Romancing Saga 2, which we talked about when we revisited the Saga series recently in episode 283. But while consoles were in the middle of a generation and refining what they already did well, the rest of the industry, in all honesty, was absolutely on fire. The Mist, Mist, and the Seventh Guest were released that year. We've done episodes on both of those. They were collectively responsible for widespread adoption of CD-ROM drives in computers. Towards the end of the year, Doom would be released in 93, completely changing the first-person shooting genre and setting off this firestorm of rapid evolution as the rest of the first-person shooting genre just pushed the whole gaming industry along. And like I said, we've covered them all. Mist was episode 160, Seventh Guest was 83, Doom really early on. Doom was episode 15. In arcades, players were getting their first real taste of the future in mid to late 93. Virtual Fighter and Daytona USA arrived, offering arcade gamers jaw-dropping glimpses of polygonal 3D. I mean,
And
Daytona USA.
33 years later, Daytona USA is still going strong.
It really is. I mean, Daytona USA blew my mind when I saw it, and it's still just as fun and good to play now as
Honestly,
it
I think that
was.
every time you and I go to the arcade or I go with anyone else, always have to do at least a two-person Daytona.
I
Every
agree.
time.
I
Never
absolutely
fails.
agree. I
Insane.
I know that it held up. It held up for so long. So there was a lot of momentum as the calendar switched over to 1994. 1994 was, I think, an incredibly important year for gaming history. On consoles, the 16-bit era was reaching its creative peak. The Super Nintendo saw landmark releases like Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, and Square's own Final Fantasy VI. These are games that proved just how expressive, cinematic, and mechanically dense cartridge based games could possibly be. And at the same time, the future, as was obvious by 93, was already knocking, right? On PC, the shift to 3D was happening incredibly fast. Games like Doom and Quake were redefining how players thought about space, movement, and immersion. Hardware acceleration and texture mapped environments and true polygonal worlds. They weren't just experiments anymore, they were becoming expectations. Developmental priorities on PC were rapidly leaving sprite based design behind as these 3D graphic accelerators were coming out and the technology was progressing. Everyone was jumping on the 3D bandwagon. And I think in the midst of all this excitement, and this is something I think is really gonna get you because it got me, Rob. I think in all this excitement, it's really hard to think about the fact that consoles weren't far behind when we have this discussion. All right. So in 1994, Super Metroid came out in March, Final Fantasy VI came out in April, Earthbound August, and Donkey Kong Country released on November 18th. Just 15 days later, on December 3rd, 1994, the Sony PlayStation released in Japan.
Wow.
Let that sink in for a moment, because that got me. Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo and the Sony PlayStation console are 15 days apart. Now, I know that Donkey Kong Country is a kind of a middle ground, right? In terms of like the graphics and the 3D technology and so on and so forth.
I think it's fantastic. What are you talking about?
No, it's great. It is fantastic. But the thing of it is I know it's not. The point I'm trying to make is I know it's not that big of a technological leap, but it feels like one at the same time. Because for me, I think of them as worlds apart, right? Donkey Kong Country is for the Super Nintendo, which was one generation. And the PlayStation, I think of with all these 3D things we're talking about, right? 3D Resident Evil and 3D Daytona USC and 3D Final Fantasy 7 and 3D and 3D and 3D. And it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that those two things released 15 days apart.
I mean, I guess for me, the part that makes it a little easier to comprehend is that we still have a lot of the 2D style games. I mean, a few years ago, one of the biggest games was Cuphead.
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's so common for us to have those 2D and 3D nowadays. I guess it's a lot different for me just because it seems so commonplace now.
True. But back then it wasn't.
Yeah, no,
And
exactly. That's why I think it's different for you. I mean, I wouldn't be born for another month
true
when
statement.
the PlayStation was released. So,
Let that sink in. No, I'm just kidding.
hey, they
15
let
days
that
later,
sink in, that's for sure.
it it's just so hard. It's just so hard to think about it, right? They're 15 days apart, they're generations apart, they're eons apart. And I know it would be some time before we got the PlayStation in the United States. I think a year later, roughly. But just I don't know. That's just such a like an it was such again a stat that just hit me across the face. I was like, "There's no way they're only 15 days apart." Oh, yep, sure enough. So now we have all this technology, right? CD-ROMs, full motion video, 3D graphics. These were all things that you only saw in arcades or on computers, and suddenly with the PlayStation, it was possible to have them at home. So the industry finds itself split. One foot is planted firmly in mastery because as we entered the end of the 16-bit era, there were developers out there that were squeezing every last trick out of the 16-bit hardware that they now fully understood. But on the other hand, the other foot was stepping into uncertainty, right? There were new tools, new cameras, new engines. In 3D, you have to think there are completely new ways of thinking about games altogether. And if you look inside Square itself during the same time period, you will see the exact same tension playing out. On one side of the studio, Mastery. Final Fantasy VI had just shipped, and it represented the peak of Square's 16-bit craft. The team knew how to make the Super Nintendo sing. For American audiences, to be specific, Final Fantasy III here is what we're talking about. 6 in Japan was released as 3 over here. So just so we're on the same page.
Oh.
Ooh. It was kind of weird because we went right from 3 to 7. And I don't think American audiences understood that at first, but such is life. These developers understood the Super Nintendo's memory limits. They understood its memory they understood its animation tricks, its audio quirks, and how to bend cartridge-based hardware into something cinematic and emotionally dense. Years of iteration had now paid off, and Square at this point was one of the most confident role playing developers in the world. At the same time, elsewhere in the building, at this point, Chrono Trigger was in development. That's a project that only existed because Square felt so secure in its understanding of the hardware and the genre. Chrono Trigger wasn't out there chasing the future. That's what Final Fantasy VII is about to do. Chrono Trigger, instead, at the time, is refining the present. It pulled together some of the most experienced designers in the company and used that confidence to experiment with structure, to experiment with pacing and storytelling in ways that only a studio at the height of its powers could attempt. Chrono Trigger was and is Square at its most assured, right? They're not just making great role playing games, but they're actively redefining what a 2D role playing game could be. There are few people in this world, I think, that would call Chrono Trigger as anything less than a revolutionary masterpiece for its time. But on the other side of the studio was uncertainty. Once Final Fantasy VI shipped, Square began looking towards an unfamiliar future. Because right after 6 shipped, early planning would begin for what would become Final Fantasy VII. And with it came the realization that the next generation wouldn't just be a technical upgrade. It was going to require an entirely new way of thinking about game development. We did a whole episode on Final Fantasy VII and this concept. There were new cameras, and now you had polygons, and you had storage that was so much bigger than before, and you had to develop new production pipelines. Nothing about 3D development at this point mapped cleanly onto what Square already knew. So Square found itself split, much like the industry at large. Veteran staff were beginning to orient towards the future, towards long term experiments and unproven technology, while at the same time, the Super Famicom, a platform that they had completely figured out, became the safest place to let other voices step forward. And so, if you were going to give a younger team room to experiment, this was the moment and this was the hardware. And that's where our topic today, Bahamut Lagoon, enters the picture. Bahamut Lagoon wasn't designed to be the next Final Fantasy. It wasn't built to carry the studio into the 3D era. It was a product of transition. It was created in the space where Square could afford to explore strange ideas, to blend genres, and to hand the real responsibility of making a game to developers who were still finding their footing. And so I think it's important to know as we go through this story that Bahamut Lagoon wasn't made during a transitional moment. It was very much made because of one. Because when you look at the team behind Bahamut Lagoon, what stands out isn't just the talent, it's how early this moment was for so many of them. Today, names like Kazushige Nojima are inseparable from Square's biggest works. You know him as one of the key writers behind Final Fantasy VII, 8, 10, and Kingdom Hearts, someone whose stories helped define Square's identity well into the 3D era. But in 1994, that future wasn't written yet. Nojima had just joined Square from Data East. Bahamut Lagoon was his first time directing a project at the company and one of his earliest chances to take ownership of a game's overall narrative. He wasn't a well known name yet. He was just a new hire being trusted with something real. The same goes for Matomu Toriyama. Toriyama, best known for his work on Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels, and for helping shape Square's approach to cinematic storytelling in the high def era. But when development began on Bahamut Lagoon, he had never worked on a video game before. He joined Square in 1994 with no prior game development experience, and Bahamut Lagoon was also his first major assignment. Not a procedural handed to a veteran, it's a learning opportunity inside a studio that suddenly had the room to teach. Years later, Toriyama would describe this period as unusually flexible, with fewer rigid job definitions and more room to grow simply by doing the work. Heck, even Hironobu Sakaguchi appears here, but in a very different role than fans might expect. By this point, Sakaguchi had already shepherded Final Fantasy VI to release, and was beginning to shift his attention toward what would eventually become Final Fantasy VII. And Bahamut Lagoon, he's listed as a supervisor. He's not a driving creative force, but a guiding presence. His involvement gives the project credibility, but still allowed less established developers to take the lead while they were all operating under Square's umbrella. And this same pattern repeats across the rest of the team. Noriko Matsuda, who composed the game's music early in her career, Bahamut Lagoon was only her second major video game score, following some co-composition work on Front Mission. She wasn't yet known for any of the body of work that would come later. This is when she was proving herself. Producer Tadashi Nomura wasn't a public facing creative name at the time either. His role was organizational and supportive, helping keep this young team moving forward inside this rapidly shifting studio. And at the center of it all was Hitoshi Sasaki, whose original concept sparked the project. Now, Sasaki was already known internally for his graphic design work on Final Fantasy VI, but as it turns out, Bahamut Lagoon was the game he had wanted to make for years. And so this was his chance to move from these supporting roles into leading what would become one of Square's more experimental projects. So again, not a team assembled from Square's most established stars. This is a group of newer developers being given real responsibility on hardware the studio fully understood at a moment when its senior staff was looking elsewhere.
It's kind of like when S.H.I.E.L.D. first formed the Avengers.
Is it?
Well, you get a bunch of people who would go on to become great heroes in their own, and that they're coming to work together for the first time to form a team and see what they can accomplish.
Bahamut Lagoon doesn't start as some grand strategic initiative. It begins as a simple idea. Development on the game traces back to 1993, shortly after Final Fantasy VI had shipped. The concept again comes from Hitoshi Sasaki, and Sasaki has said that at its core, he wanted to make a game about dragons. But dragons not just as summons or symbols, but as living creatures. Creatures that players would raise, creatures that players could nurture, and most importantly, creatures that players could fight alongside. Now, the dragons weren't about spectacle alone. The goal was to make the dragons feel present and unpredictable, to tie the dragons deeply to the player's decisions. And this is the idea that came first. Long before any genre labels were attached to the game, long before any systems were fully defined. In fact, Bahamut Lagoon didn't even begin life under its own name. Early in development, the project was internally associated with the working title Final Fantasy Tactics, which we know became a completely different game. And this was not because it was meant to be a mainline Final Fantasy release, but because as they sat down in this planning stage, it grew out of conversations about what a tactical style Final Fantasy game could look like. At that point, the idea of applying strategy role playing mechanics to Square's turn based design sensibilities, that was still an exploratory concept, not formalized in any way, shape, or form. And that's a connection, though, that didn't last. It didn't stay Final Fantasy Tactics. As the concept evolved, it became clear that what Sasaki and the team were building didn't have a place within the Final Fantasy framework. The focus on dragon autonomy, experimental systems, and this more fragmented interpersonal narrative pushed the project in its own direction.
Which is hilarious when you think that had no place in Final Fantasy, and then you think about modern Final Fantasy.
True statement. The Final Fantasy label was obviously dropped, and at this point, the game began to take on an identity that made it stand apart from the flagship series. And it was an interesting path because, truthfully, Bahamut Lagoon didn't start out as a strategy RPG. Its early planning began from a more traditional role playing structure because, again, that's what Square already knew. But as development progressed, the team began experimenting with how battles could unfold across a wider space, not just in terms of like menus and turns, but more specifically in like terrain and positioning and movement. And so as they began to have these discussions, again, those experiments pulled the project towards a hybrid form where they were blending turn-based strategy with familiar, RPG battle encounters, hence Final Fantasy Tactics. But again, it didn't feel like a Final Fantasy game, so the tactics kind of stayed, but the Final Fantasy went away. Now, this shift wasn't really driven by market trends or competition. This shift happened internally, by the small team that were testing ideas on hardware and then discovering that their original concept for dragons and dragon autonomy worked better when it was viewed from a tactical top down perspective. And so their genre, their strategy genre specifically, it emerged more organically and not really as a mandate. It's definitely not where they started, but it is obviously where they ended up. And so it goes without saying that production on Bahamut Lagoon didn't begin as a single clearly announced initiative. We know it began as idea and it evolved. Just like the industry was transitioning in the mid 90s, just like Square was transitioning in the mid 90s, so too was the development of Lagoon. And this small team was left on their own to experiment. They had some ideas, they played around with them, they found what worked, what didn't work, they put it all together, and they built one of the more unique games in the Square library as a result. By late 95, development wrapped on Bahamut Lagoon, and this positioned Bahamut Lagoon for an early 1996 release. And so in February of 96, it arrives not as some grand finale for the 16-bit era, but as one of its genuinely last confident expressions. A game created during the overlap between mastery and uncertainty when no one really knew where anything was headed next. Rob, I think what makes Bahamut Lagoon so interesting is that it exists in the quiet space between eras. There's no rush to chase the future, just a team given time to explore ideas and see what worked.
Right. No pressure to redefine the industry, just focusing on making something thoughtful.
Exactly. And honestly, that's what I love about podcasting when you got the right tools. And that's why I use Zencaster. It's an all in one podcasting platform that lets you focus on the work and not the tech.
So I don't need to worry about setups or hardware before I even start.
Not at all. You just log into your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. There's no complicated setups, no distractions from the creative process.
But what if something goes wrong mid recording? Old cartridges didn't exactly have backup plans.
Well, that's where Zencaster really helps. It uses multi layered backups, so even if your connection drops, your recordings stay safe in the highest quality. You can experiment without worrying about losing your work.
And editing? Please tell me I don't have to micromanage every little detail.
You don't. Zencaster's post production tools automatically clean up background noise, remove filler words, and balance your audio. You get polished results without breaking your flow.
So once it's finished, how do I actually get it out there?
Well, that's the best part. Zencaster also lets you distribute your podcast directly to platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all from the same dashboard. From recording to release, everything happens in one place.
So there's less worrying about the future and more focusing on what you're making?
Exactly. Go over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any paid plan if you're interested in focusing on what you're making. If you've been thinking about starting a podcast, this is the easiest way to begin.
So take your time and build something you're proud of.
That's right. Head over to Zencaster, Use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month.
And now, let's talk about what actually made it onto the cartridge.
Rob, for most American players, Bahamut Lagoon has no cultural shorthand, right? There's no box art memory, there was no magazine coverage, there was no rental store encounter. It wasn't released over here, so if you didn't actively seek it out years later, the game simply didn't exist. It was released exclusively in Japan for the Super Famicom in February of 1996. It never received an official Western localization, probably because it arrived at a time when attention from both Square and the industry was already shifting towards the next generation. So I thought it important to do something that we don't normally do and ground ourselves into basics and talk about what Bahamut Lagoon actually is. At a glance, Bahamut Lagoon is a tactical role playing game. Battles take place on a grid based map viewed from the top down perspective, with units positioned, moved, and commanded turn by turn. That alone places it in the same broad family as games like Fire Emblem, for instance. But realistically, that description only gets you halfway there. Because in Bahamut Lagoon, the battlefield isn't just populated by human characters, each unit is also paired with a dragon, which is a living creature, a dragon, that fights alongside you. It grows over time and fundamentally alters how combat unfolds. These dragons aren't like passive stat bonuses or one off summons. They are persistent entities. They're pets in a way. They all have their own behaviors and elemental alignments and their own growth paths. Players feed them items, you shape their development and their influence, but you never ever get to control them directly. And so their control in battle is kind of passive. And that
You
lack of
know, that gives a total Pokemon without the correct gym badge for the level
mm-hmm.
vibes.
It kind of does, except in Pokemon, like you tell it to do a specific move. And the dragons, you literally don't. The dragons have their own turn, and they make their own decisions and their own moves based on how they're growing up and developing.
No, obviously I can definitely see a huge difference between them, but it just gives off that same vibe. Like I remember many times where my Charizard's like, "Nah, bro, I'm not listening to you," and he was a dragon, so it makes sense. They probably
Yep.
got inspiration from this.
That lack of control is intentional. That indirect control is what they were going for. When combat begins, you issue orders to your human units, you position them, and you initiate attacks. And once your human units resolve their attacks, the dragons themselves act independently. They may support an action you intended, or they may intervene in ways you didn't anticipate, like finishing enemies early, triggering different outcomes, even altering what rewards you can receive at the end of a fight. And this means that battles in Bahamut Lagoon don't unfold with perfect predictability. Planning matters, and positioning matters, and preparation matters, but the game always leaves some room for friction between what you intend and the outcome. Outside of combat, Bahamut Lagoon is structured as a chapter based narrative. Each chapter advances a larger political and interpersonal storyline, introducing new characters and shifting alliances and also reframing earlier events. Rather than focusing on a single wandering hero, the game presents you with a cast of officers and commanders and companions, all that are embedded within this broader military conflict. In between battles, you manage equipment and you assign dragons and you make other decisions that quietly shape how your characters and dragons evolve over time. There's not really a single correct build, there's no obvious optimal path. Much of the game's identity comes from discovering how its systems interact through use, not by explaining how they do it. Visually, Bahamut Lagoon sits at the far end of what the Famicom could do. That's not surprising considering how far into the 16-bit era it came. It has large expressive sprites and elaborate spell effects. There are dense battle animations that, briefly shift perspective to sell impact and motion. It's not hard to, know by looking at it that it's a late era 16-bit game. It's confident and detailed and I don't know, unafraid to push presentation beyond what was common earlier in that console's lifespan. I think perhaps the most important thing I want everyone to understand, at least from my perspective, is Bahamut Lagoon doesn't feel like a refinement of an existing Square formula, right? It feels like a studio asking, what else can we do with all these tools that we already understand? It blends strategy and role playing, not to chase a trend, but because its core idea, which is fighting alongside creatures you can guide but not fully command, demands it. The structure they built for the game exists to serve that idea, not the other way around. And so for players encountering it today, I think that makes Bahamut Lagoon feel unusual, maybe even slightly off balance. But the context of when it was made and who was making it, I think it's important to recognize that strangeness is the point. And before we go any further, it's worth addressing the question, why didn't Bahamut Lagoon ever leave Japan? And I think the simple answer is timing. By the time Bahamut Lagoon released in February of 96, the Famicom was no longer Square's future, it was its past. Again, the studio had already shifted its attention towards the PlayStation and other projects that were taking advantage of, 3D graphics and CD-ROM storage. So by this point, Final Fantasy VII was deep into development, and Square's publishing priorities are moving forward. So from a business perspective, Bahamut Lagoon was a hard sell overseas. It was literally released just months, before Square's final Nintendo era titles came in the very end. Came in the very end. It's not a numbered Final Fantasy. It blends genres in a way that doesn't neatly fit in all these Western marketing categories. And besides that, to begin with, strategy role playing games were still a niche outside of Japan, especially on consoles. So, for all these reasons, Bahamut Lagoon quietly stayed home. And for several years, that's where its story ended. But then in the late 90s, early 2000s, something changed because as emulation spread and online communities grew, Western players began to discover just how many Square titles had never been localized. At that time, there were games like Final Fantasy V, for instance, and Seiken Densetsu 3, part of the Mana series, and Bahamut Lagoon specifically. They became part of this growing lost library, right? Games that people knew existed but couldn't play because of localization. Bahamut Lagoon stands out immediately in that lost library. It has Square's name, it has dragons, it looks lavish. Screenshots alone make it clear that this isn't a minor side project, and so interest builds quickly, even among players who had never touched a strategy role playing game before. In 2002, that curiosity finally turns into access, right? There's a fan translation group called Dejap that releases a full English patch for Bahamut Lagoon, making it playable for Western audiences for the first time. And for many players in the West, this was their introduction not just to the game, but to the concept, the idea that Square's 16-bit output was far larger and especially stranger than what officially had made it overseas. For nearly 2 decades, that translation became the way that Western players knew Bahamut Lagoon. But then in 2020, something else happened. A new fan translation that was built with modern ROM hacking techniques and a far more literal approach to the script was released. Not meant to replace the first translation, but more so meant to reevaluate the translation itself. And so it refined the presentation, corrected some long-standing technical limitations because now we have 20 years of emulation under our belt, and kind of reframed the game for a new generation of players who now are probably encountering it as historical curiosity rather than the rumor of a new game. By that point, Bahamut Lagoon's reputation had already shifted. It was no longer just the Square game we never got. Now it had become something else entirely. All parts of our conversation today, right? It's a case study in late era experimentation. It's a snapshot of Square in transition. And truthfully, for players discovering for today, it's not just a lost relic. It's a missing chapter. It's a super interesting story in Square's library that is now accessible to Western audiences. If you want to go play Bahamut Lagoon, You can. And actually the most recent translation I've played it's good. Like it's good. If you've never tried it, it's a good time to try it. I would highly suggest it. If Bahamut Lagoon feels like a side path rather than a centerpiece, that's because it was. It wasn't Square's flagship project. It wasn't meant to redefine the genre. It was just a product of the same creative movement that produced some of the company's most ambitious work, just viewed from a different angle. Now, we've talked about this period before. In episode 283, we revisited Romancing Saga, where we explored how Akitoshi Kawazu was already pushing against traditional role playing game structures, experimenting with nonlinear progression, player choice, and systems that trust curiosity over direction. Back in episode 258, Secret of Mana showed another side of Square's identity in the early 90s, cooperative play, technical ingenuity, and a willingness to rethink how action RPGs could feel on the same 16-bit hardware. And then if you want, go all the way back to episode 50. Chrono Trigger represents Square's most confident, a project where its biggest creative voices aligned to produce something timeless. Of course, if you want to visit any of these stories, you can do so by going to our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people do on our website?
Well, you can find a calendar of our future episode topics to know what we'll be talking about in our coming weeks. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I about various topics over there. You can find access to our Patreon where you can get access to ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. And you can find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, or a console. We've even covered a few places as well. We'll tell you each story. We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's a fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning, and in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, Dave, why don't you tell everyone what you're thinking today? Because it's probably going to be the same.
It's the 15 days thing.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's not as much of a shock to me just because I didn't grow up with both of those and see the huge transition. It was already all that way for me when I got there. But it is still crazy to think just the technology difference and how it's so close. And even if it wasn't here in the U.S., which why it might seem a little less of a spectacle, it just it's never shocking to see the difference in development for video games with Japan and America.
I agree with that. Now, with that being said, I said I played Bahamut Lagoon, but I played Bahamut Lagoon in preparation for this episode. So I'm not going to pretend I was familiar with it in any way but just knowing what it was prior to doing my research on this episode. So my familiarity with it increased in the sense that I played it to better understand what it was as part of my research. And I will say that is probably my favorite part slash takeaway is just having the opportunity to do that because this is, let's be honest, I love that period of time for Square. It is so nostalgic for me. The Final Fantasy 3, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, the 90s Super Nintendo role playing Square period is probably one of my most nostalgic periods for all of gaming history. That's just my personal history. I loved it, played all of them. So to fill in this gap that I never got to experience and see the relationship, between my nostalgia and this was a lot of fun to be totally honest with you. I would highly recommend it. I think it's still a great role-playing game. I think a lot of those role-playing games from that time period hold up incredibly well, including this one. All right, Rob. Well, before I wrap it up and take it into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take one quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us to have you along, and we appreciate you.
By the time Bahamut Lagoon arrived, the rules of the industry were already changing. The Super Famicom was a known platform, and Square had mastered it. The future was already pulling the studio into other directions, and frankly, I think that's what makes this game interesting. Bahamut Lagoon wasn't chasing attention, it wasn't trying to set expectations. It was made during a moment when Square had the luxury, had the freedom to slow down, had the luxury of handing the reins over to a younger team to see what happened when ideas were allowed to exist without a roadmap to the next generation. And so the result wasn't a headline game, it's rather a thoughtful one, confident, self contained, probably unconcerned with whether or not it would be remembered outside of its original audience. And because of that, it offers this really rare glimpse of Square as a studio that's comfortable with uncertainty, a studio that's willing to experiment quietly while the industry moves on around it. Games like Bahamut Lagoon don't always survive in this conversation, but they do matter because they show us how creative identities are maintained, not through constant reinvention, but through moments of trust, patience, and restraint. It's an important reminder that sometimes the clearest view of a studio's philosophy isn't found in its biggest hits, but in the games that it made when no one was watching. Next week, we're stepping back to a moment when Atari briefly opened the doors and let its players become creators. Launched in 1981, the Atari Program Exchange was one of the earliest attempts at a curated, user submitted game marketplace. It was a place where hobbyists could send in their own code and see it sold alongside official releases. It was really a bold idea, born at a time when the line between player and developer was still blurry. Before app streams, before mods went mainstream, long before indie was a category, Atari tried doing something unusual. So join us as we explore the rise and quiet disappearance of the Atari Program Exchange as we take next week's trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Skibidim dap dap dam doo.